So every now and again, you'll come across a piece of gear that is so well priced that you almost feel like you're robbing the brand because you know that item should be worth a lot more money. And that's exactly what I've got in this box today. I honestly believe that this amp is the absolute best bargain, the best for 2025. In this box, I have the PRS HDRX20 amp, which is an all-tube amp based on Jimi Hendrix's classic Woodstock amp. And the best part about it is I got this for less than £400. So as I said, I got this for less than £400, £399 to be exact. And you can thank the good people over at Peach Guitars for that, because they are currently having a big sale on these amps. This isn't a sponsored video in any way. I literally bought this amp with my own money. I saw the price they had this listed for, and I've been looking at getting one of these for a while, and they're originally priced over £800. Seeing one for less than 400, I knew I had to just buy one straight away. And that's why I think this is going to be the bargain of 2025, because what we have here is a Paul Reed Smith all valve amp for the same price that you can pick up most standard solid state amps. So here it is, for under £400 in the UK, you can get the PRS HDRX20. Now, as I said, I've been eyeing up one of these for a long time. I've always wanted to add a PRS amp to my collection and never really had the right opportunity because they were always a bit out of budget. The fact that this now is less than £400 is quite astounding, actually. So I'm going to check this thing out in this video, give you some first impressions, and let's see if this really is the best bargain of the year. And I'm pretty confident in saying I think it will be. So the HDRX amp story starts back in 2018 when Paul Reed Smith and PRS amp designer Doug Sewell were actually granted access to some of Jimi's personal amps. And the one in particular that they spent the time studying and basically mapping out the schematic of was the amp that he supposedly used at the famous Woodstock Festival. And that is what they managed to distill into this amp. So the HDRX20 is the smallest one in the family. You've also got the 50 and the 100, which are both hand-wired in the US. This one is made in Asia for a fraction of the price. These used to retail at 800 to 900 in the UK, and obviously now you can get them for under 400, so act fast because I don't think these will be sticking around for very long at that price. The 50 and the 100 actually start at £2,000 plus because they're hand-wired in the US. So it's quite a big difference, but essentially you get the same amp. A lot of the stuff inside is basically the same as the bigger versions, other than the obvious wattage differences. So the amp this is based on is Jimi Hendrix's personal Woodstock amp. Now obviously with this being a PRS amp, they can't use any of the terminology like Marshall or Plexi or any of that stuff, so they've had to call this the HDRX, which is obviously a reference to Jimi. But what the amp actually was a very heavily modded Marshall. So Jimi was prone to playing very, very loud, as we know, and as such, the basic amp circuitry just couldn't handle the amount it was being pushed. So he was blowing up valves all the time, and there was all sorts of different problems. So over the years, the amp was modified and modified to basically live up to the punishment that Hendrix was putting it through. So as such, when they actually opened up the amp and started mapping it out, it was actually nothing really like what they thought it was going to be, because they went into it thinking they were just going to see the inside of another Marshall from that era. But actually what they were met with was really quite different, which again is part of why Hendrix had such a unique sound, because the amp had basically been redesigned around his playing style and his needs as a guitar player. So this version of the amp is actually based around a pair of 5881 power amp tubes. Now when we think Marshall and 60s tones, we often think of what we assume to be more British power amp tubes like EL34s or EL84s or something in that ballpark. But the 5881s are actually part of the 6L6 family. They're actually basically like a military spec 6L6. So they're much more robust, higher headroom, less kind of squishy and compressed than a typical, you know, an EL34 or a KT88 or whatever you would have found in Marshalls at that particular time period. So what we actually get is kind of a cross between like a Fender-y amp with a Marshall. So you get that nice chiminess that you get from an American clean amp, but with that mid-range roar that you get from a British amp. So that is one thing that definitely makes Hendrix's mods to the amps pretty unique in that sense, because they don't just sound like off-the-shelf Marshalls. That character is really something that Paul and Doug wanted to capture in the HDRX amp. They didn't want this to be a Marshall clone. They wanted this to be a replica of the amp that Hendrix actually played, so that if you're a Hendrix fan, you can literally plug into the amp and get those classic tones. But also, if you're not a Hendrix fan, it just offers you a really interesting take on the classic Marshall sound. This is just a single channel amp, and with it being part of the Plexi family, really the way to get this thing to drive is to crank it. Now what Paul and Doug did do is they designed the 20 watt version to have a master volume, which actually allows you to get the sounds at a lower volume. The 50 and the 100 are much more untamable beasts because they're a hell of a lot louder, and these amps are loud. For a 20 watt amp, these things are pretty punishing. So what we have is a really interesting gain layout here, because you've got your master volume, which obviously controls the output volume of the amp. But then you have a bass and a treble volume. Now you can kind of think of these as like preamp gains, but what they've done is they've kind of split the gain into two structures here. You've got the treble and the bass. So you can actually dial in the amount of gain you want in the lows and the highs. This is kind of like a potentiometer variation on the classic jumper cable method for the old Marshalls, where you had the 4 inputs. So you can dial in the right mix of low gain and high gain as well. And when I say low and high gain, I mean frequency low and high, not the amount of gain, all the way up to, you know, completely cranked. The only amp I've ever actually seen this on before is actually this Marshall here at the back of my studio, which is a Marshall 2466 from the vintage modern series, and that actually has the same preamp system where it has a master volume and then a bass and a treble gain. That's the only other time I've actually seen that in action in another amp. 3-band EQ and a presence control. Very simple. There's not much to that, and why does there need to be? And then on the back, that's also very simple. You've basically just got outputs for your speakers. You've got 2 4 ohm, 2 8 ohm, and a single 16 ohm. Some bias points for your tubes, and the AC power adapter. And that's it. There's no effects loop, there's no foot switches, there's nothing that doesn't need to be there. It's literally a straight to the point amp that you plug in and get some great sounds out of. It's pretty lightweight as well. I think this is around the 10 to 12 kilo mark. And on top of the amp, which is pretty cool, you actually get this kind of cheat sheet with some kind of presets to try out. You've got Paul's favorite set in a clean and a California crunch. And I should also mention, with this being from Jimi's actual amp, that was approved by the Hendrix estate. So this isn't just Paul and Doug saying, oh, PRS have made a copy of a Hendrix amp. This literally has the Hendrix seal of approval on the back. You can see there, it says authentic Hendrix and it has Jimmy's signature on it. So not only is this based on Jimmy's amp, but it's literally been approved by the people who run Jimmy's estate. So without buying the actual Woodstock amp, this is as close as you're gonna get to the real deal. So as I said, I've been looking at one of these for a long time, and then when I saw them come up for this price, I had to instantly buy it. I didn't even question it. It was just, I'm gonna buy this right now because I need it. And I haven't even heard it yet. I've literally taken this out of the box in front of you guys, so I'm gonna plug this in now and we're gonna get some sounds out of it. Right, so we're all plugged in, but I did realize I got a bit too excited when I was unboxing it and I actually forgot to tell you about two little things. There's these two small toggle switches here on the amp. This one here is like a high mid gain boost. So when you're playing with overdriven sounds, it'll just give a bit of a kick to the upper mids, useful if you want to get into some more like cranked marshally territory. And then over here, we have a bright switch, and that just adds some extra top end frequency as well. So a combination of the bass and treble volumes, coupled with the bright switch, coupled with a mid gain boost, kind of gives you all the different approximations you can get from the 4-cable jumper method on a regular old vintage Plexi. So now that it's plugged in, let's get some sounds. So I'm just going to start with everything just straight up at midnight. I think that's a pretty fair way to start. Bright switch is off and mid gain switch is off as well. That's a pretty good starting point, actually, considering that's just everything straight up at midnight. Now, the amp actually feels very responsive. It kind of reminds me of like the immediacy of like Dumble clones that I've played. Not that this sounds anything like a Dumble, I'm just saying like there's a feel thing with certain amps where the note is so fast and so immediate. This kind of has that. There's not much sag to it. I'm just going to dial up the gain a little bit and kind of dial in what I would probably set my EQ to. That's quite nice. That's kind of where I would like this amp to be. Let's kick on the high mid gain boost. That's nice. That kind of just adds this little extra cut on the drive. Bright switch. I mean, I'm already sold just on that tone alone. Bit more gain. So the amp is starting to come alive the more I'm pushing it, and That kind of presents a problem if you're using it without an attenuator. I'm actually using this to the 2 Notes Capture X right now, so I'm massively attenuating the sound, but I've got the master volume on halfway. Now what's going to happen is as we crank this, there's a little bit of noise coming in, but that's kind of to be expected. But we're going to bring in more of that power amp saturation as well, and this is where it's going to get a bit more saggy. In a lot of the videos I've heard of other people playing this, when you get to this point, it starts to almost go into like fuzz territory, which is quite interesting. Now that's interesting because this is where I can see the bass and treble volumes and preamp gains coming in a lot of use, because as you get to this kind of gain level, the low end, especially on the neck pickup, starts to get quite fuzzy, but single notes sound great up the neck. Very kind of fat, which is nice. I could dial back that low end though. Wow, I mean, there's a lot of gain there. Let's just crank that gain and crank the master. So that's where it starts to go into the kind of fuzzier territories. That's very interesting. Now, if you want to go clean, you actually have to do something quite weird with this, which is dial the preamp volumes all the way back and the master volume all the way up. And that then allows you to get this higher headroom clean sound. Now, while that's not perfectly clean, it's right on the edge of breakup, so if you're playing soft, you get that nice chime, but then you dig in. I also have the gain boost on there as well, so let me just turn that off. Then you get a kind of a woodier clean sound, which is very nice. So that's very impressive. Let's scoop the mids a bit and see if we can get it a little bit more American. That's very cool. There's a lot of really cool sounds there. It goes from it's very much edge of breakup rather than super clean. I did dial the volume back a little bit, and I guess if we dial that back a bit more, we can get even cleaner. It does kind of feel like as we lose the master volume with the preamp gains that low, it loses a lot of the body. So the amp kind of comes alive when it's about 8. You get a much more full range signal, but that's very interesting. This is going to be an amp that I'm going to have a lot of fun getting to know, I think. I'm just going to quickly switch to a humbucker guitar, and then I'm just going to play for a couple of minutes and go from this cleaner sound right through some higher gain stuff. Oh, wow, okay. Wow. Yeah, that does get very fuzzy when you crank, especially with humbuckers. That really pushes it into this, like, there's a lot of overtones when you play with a humbucker, especially with everything on full. It's a cool sound. I actually really like it when you dial the bass right back, the bass volume right back, so you just get this kind of brighter gain. That's the sort of like cranked Plexius kind of vibe I like. That actually reminds me of how I used to use my old Marshall in that same way, where I would actually use the treble gain to get that brightness and then just bring the lows into taste. I mean, yeah, that's... I'm very impressed out of the box, I'll be honest. I mean, it's the first time I've ever played this amp, and there's a lot of sounds in there that I really, really like. This is an amp I'm going to have a lot of fun with, I think, and I kind of need to figure out, you know, exactly what I want it for and what I want to use it for, and based on the last couple of minutes alone, I think this is definitely an amp that I'm going to be using a lot. And I still stand by what I said earlier on in the video, where I think this is 100% guaranteed to be the bargain of the year. So yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed with this. I've wanted to try a PRS amp for the longest time, and this is one I've been keeping an eye on because I thought, well, if there's one that's really going to fit me, it's going to be the HDRX. And I guess I was right about that. I'm very, very glad that I've managed to get my hands on one of these. And as I said earlier on in the video, potentially this, I'm going to go on a limb and say this is probably the best bargain of the year. They're $3.99 at the time of shooting this video in Peach Guitars in the UK. Usually the retail price is more than double that. So if you're interested in one of these, or you like the stuff you hear in this video, or you think this amp will be a good fit for you, I would seriously consider not hanging around, because I really don't think they're going to be around at that price for very long. If you've tried one, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this amp as well. It's different to your typical Plexi. It may be divisive to Plexi traditionalists, but you know, it doesn't get more traditional than literally what Hendrix used. So PRS has done a great job on this one. I'm looking forward to getting to know this amp a little bit better. Let me know what you guys thought down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching as always. I'll see you very soon.